Welcome to Copenhagenchronicles, a podcast in English about the Danish tales of the past. Fall has finally come to Denmark, and with fall, rain and darker days comes Halloween. Halloween is still a fairly new tradition in Denmark, and while a handful of people are yet to take to the tradition, it is one of the traditions I like to celebrate the most. So of course, I had to make a podcast episode celebrating the dark and mysterious. I hope to make many more episodes investigating the darker sides of Denmark and Copenhagen's history, since it's an interest of mine. But for now, we will tackle the concept of witches and their influence in Danish history. Please enjoy. The year is 1589. You are a sailor, and right now you are desperately grasping on to the ship's wet and slippery railing, praying to God this voyage will not be your last. As storm rages around you, and the other 250 men aboard the Gideon, one of the 13 ships heading for Scotland across the Sound. The journey has been long expected and meticulously planned for months in advance. For this journey is not just any journey. No. Aboard, you have Princess Anna, sister of Denmark's King Christian IV and fiancée to James VI, the King of Scotland. And she is heading for nothing less than her wedding, which is to take place very soon. But despite the rigorous planning by Admiral Peder Munk, a skilled and highly renowned admiral with several successful expeditions under his belt, and Master of Interest Christopher Valkendorf, who were in charge of the fleet's economy, everything that could go wrong went wrong. For this was not the first time the fleet tried to make its way to Scotland. This was the second. The first time the King's fleet attempted to reach across the North Sea, not only were the ships forced to seek cover from yet another storm at Kristiansand in Norway and stay there for weeks to rebuild after the damage from the storm, but several deaths occurred before, during and after the voyage. Just before Gideon set sail, a rifleman aboard the ship was killed. The following day, a cannon exploded, killing another man aboard. And when the ships reached Norway, 2 of them burst a leak, one of which the princess was aboard, and a man was squashed to death between the 2 ships. And there you are, still holding on to the railing, and the more you think about it, the more you add all of these unfortunate occurrences together, you think to yourself, surely this cannot be just a coincidence. Surely this cannot be the will of God. Why would he prevent this marriage between good and important people? No. Foul play must be afoot. Foul play of the worst and darkest kind. With the rising fascination and concern with witchcraft and magic that took hold in Denmark and especially the Scottish king, both the Danish and the Scottish royal courts were certain that there must have been witches involved in the storms that severely delayed the royal wedding. Especially Valkendorf, who was responsible for making sure that the fleet was equipped well enough to withstand any hardship on the way, was certain that it of course wasn't his inability to prepare the ships. No, it must have been foul play. And thus the witch hunt of 1590 in Copenhagen began. Now, what does a witch hunt exactly mean? The word is frequently used in modern terms for someone or something innocent who is being treated in an unjust way. And in a historic context, a witch hunt was not just an individual being prosecuted and punished for witchcraft. This happened throughout most of Europe and America for a span of almost 200 years. In order for a proper witch hunt to occur, one witch must appoint other witches who helped him or her with her evil deeds, who then again appoints other witches, who appoints another, and thus the ball rolls. In Europe, whole villages have been almost eradicated because of these witch hunts, which happened sporadically throughout Danish history from the 14 to the 1600s. But for this witch hunt specifically, a woman named Anna Collings was where it all began. By the time of the failing of the king's fleet, she was already imprisoned, but for witchcraft unrelated to the royal wedding. When Valkendorf was made aware that all fingers pointed towards him, he had a word with the mayor of Copenhagen and asked if he could question Anna about the king's ship and if she indeed had cursed the voyage. Under some intense questioning, aka torture, not only did Anna confess to having cursed the voyage, she also confessed to hiding demons in barrels aboard the ship who could then help create the storm. Torture was not an unknown form of interrogation in Denmark at the time, especially when it came to the worst form of crime, that of the unholy. Although there were certain rules surrounding the types of torture and when torture could be performed. For example, torture was only to be performed after a suspect had been found guilty. This was to prevent false confession and to make sure that the guilty fully confessed to all of their wrongdoings, thus cleansing their soul before death. But another aspect was to force as much information out of the individual as possible, and very often to have them point fingers at accomplices. The types of torture varied, but I was able to find a description of a day of a torturer from 1529. If you are sensitive to gore, please feel free to skip the next 2 minutes of the podcast. The torturer cuts the witch's hair short, binds her hands and places her over a ladder. He pours alcohol on her head and sets it afire. He places sulfur under her arms and on her back and sets it afire. He binds her hands behind her back and hangs her in the ceiling, leaving her there for 3 to 4 hours while he eats his breakfast. He places heavy weights on her body and hangs her once more. He lowers her on the ladder and pushes a wooden beam with spikes into her body. He crushes her thumbs and toes in a vise while he demands she confesses to more. He hangs her in the ceiling once more, where she passes out repeatedly. He whips her until blood runs. He sets her afire again. The next day, the whole process starts over. No wonder many accused witches did not even make it through the torture and died during the process. During the 1590s witch trials, both men and women were interrogated and were suspects. For the most part, they were people from the lower classes of society. But even a few higher standing citizens were under the microscope. And even after Anna was burned at the stake, 3 more women were also questioned. In the end, 13 people were executed by fire for having interfered with the king's fleet with unholy weather magic. Magic, both of the dark and the white kind, has been a part of European and Danish culture for hundreds of years. In Denmark, magic was common and accepted, even celebrated in the Viking Ages, where magic and contact with the gods were interwoven. And even in the early Middle Ages, around 12 to the 1400s, believing in witches was believed to be heathen, and frankly, Europe was much more focused on external affairs like wars and the Crusade in the Middle East. But this all changed in 1484, when Pope Innocent VIII released a papal bull about finding and destroying witches. 2 years after, the infamous book Malleus Maleficarum, or The Witch's Hammer, was released, and thus a massive hunt for witches with occasional witch hunts, see what I did there, began through Europe. But it was not only a matter of a pope releasing a bull. Society in the late 1400s had reached a time which made it somewhat ideal to fear the dark and different. Ships could now reach far distances, allowing trade to flourish. With trade came money, and with money came a greater distance between the poor and the wealthy. The poor were at the mercy of the church and were more often than not accused of witchcraft, and more often than not females were to blame. To be exact, 9 out of 10 witches killed were women. Women were much more vulnerable than men, especially those without a husband or close relations. After the Reformation in 1536, the church in Europe was split into Catholicism and Protestantism, and with this division came war. This left even more women without a spouse and left them even more vulnerable. For some, the only way they could make a living was to become wise women who would use white magic or good magic to help others. This could be everything from acting as a midwife during labor, to making sure the harvest would succeed, to encourage cows to produce more milk. Practical skills that, for the most part, the church did not understand, since a large part of the wise women's work were focused on females and the female body and its function. But with this power also came a fear that wise women could use it for evil, so-called black magic. These women were helping other women gain an understanding and somewhat control of their own bodies without the influence of a man. A very scary thought for the church. Even if they were accused of witchcraft, their words alone in a courtroom were not enough. They needed a male relative or priest to vouch for their good spirit or holy deeds before they even stood a chance. Women were seen as an accessory to the man, and she was seen as impure and unpredictable from biology alone. Wise women, women who could get by without the company of a man, received skepticism. Surely a woman could not take care of herself. There must be evil deeds afoot. Christian IV, the king that built Round Tower and the Stock Exchange, among other important buildings in Copenhagen, was a very active part of the Danish Witch Trials, and in 1617 he made white magic as illegal as black magic, thus tightening the already existing laws on witchcraft in Denmark. He also took active part in different witch trials around Denmark. Such was the case of Denmark's perhaps most famous witch, Maren. Maren lived in Ribe on the west coast of Jutland, and unlike so many other witches, Maren was from a wealthy tailor family and ran an inn out of one of her husband's houses. She was known to be fiercely independent and have a sharp tongue. Maren fell victim to a petty rivalry between her husband and another and less famous tailor, Didrik. I can't find his last name anywhere, so I'm just gonna call him Didrik. Didrik claimed that he was awoken in the middle of the night by 3 women in his bedroom, and one of these being Maren. They pinned him to the bed, and Maren blew into his mouth. Shortly after, he suffered nightmares and fell ill, allegedly vomiting up a moving object. During the first trial, Maren was found innocent with the help of her husband vouching for her good spirit. But unfortunately for Maren, Christian IV just so happened to be in town, and Didrik pleaded directly to him, explaining his encounter with the 3 witches. With the king's help, the case was reopened, and unless Maren could bring no less than 15 people of character to vouch for her, she would be found guilty. She did not manage to find 15 people and was marked a witch. After intense torture, she admitted her guilt and that she had participated in a witch's sabbat with other witches. The concept of a witch sabbat was first introduced in the Malleus Maleficarum, although the word sabbat was never really used. In the book it was described as witches meet together in the conclave on a set day, and the devil appears to them in the assumed body of a man, and urges them to keep faith with him, promising them worldly prosperity and length of life. And during this Sabbath, witches would allegedly have intercourse with the devil, kiss the devil's behind, boil and eat children, perform black magic, black magic was, by the way, performed backwards. So, like, literally backwards. They would dance back to back. They would kiss the devil's butt instead of his mouth. And this is also where the whole thing about flying on a backward-facing broomstick comes from. Ultimately, during the Sabbath, they would be baptized by Satan himself. This, of course, with a preacher's book made of human flesh, holy water made of urine, altar wine made of human blood, and so on. But by far the most ridiculous and frankly funny part of how the Malleus Maleficarum described witches was that they had penises as pets. Yeah, like penises. They would steal them from men and hide them in birds' nests. Like, I'm not making this up. This is from the Malleus Maleficarum. Sometimes witches collect male organs in great numbers, as many as 20 or 30 members together, and put them in a bird's nest or shut them up in a box, where they move themselves like members and eat oats and corn, as has been seen by many and is a matter of common report. Yeah, when I read this, I can't even, it's hilarious. It really is. In Denmark, witches were killed either by beheading or fire. Beheading was reserved for the much wealthier and more important individuals. Few sources also describe witches dying from drowning, although this was more common in other European countries. It was believed that the witch would float right to the surface if thrown into water, and an innocent would sink. This water test was not really meant to be a method of execution, but if the person in the water wasn't pulled out in time, well, at least they died a good Christian death, right? For Maren Splid, the only way to go was the flames. Her execution was to take place on November 9th, 1641, outside of Ribe. And the case had grown so famous that a horde of people showed up to watch. In Denmark, tying the witch to a ladder and throwing her into the fire was seen as a much more humane way to go, since death would occur quicker than building a fire around a stake. These deaths could sometimes take hours. Maren was bound to a ladder, and strapped on her back was gunpowder. This would further aid in a quick death. Although Denmark took an active part in witch hunts, only around 1,000 people were killed for witchcraft in the entire country. Compared to other European countries, like our neighbors Germany, this was a relatively small amount per capita. Even so, all those innocent lives taken for frankly ridiculous, sexist, superstitious reasons all matter. This podcast episode is made with the scary and spooky in focus, but the only scary thing about the witch hunts wasn't the witches themselves, but the people behind the hunts. To end this podcast, I would like to include one last story suggested by a listener. This is the story of Køge Huskors. In 1614, a woman named Johanne Thomas was accused of having performed witchcraft on citizens in the Zealand city of Køge. Speculations about her evil deeds first came out when a family experienced bizarre and unfortunate events within their home a couple of years beforehand. Merchant Hans Bartskær and his wife Anne Hans Bartskær were awakened one night by a most peculiar sound, the clucking of a chicken. They could have both sworn that the clucking came from underneath their bed. But when they checked, there was nothing. Later on, Anne claimed to have witnessed a toad walking on two legs in her courtyard, and that their youngest daughter was thrown violently about in her bed at night. Their three other children claimed to have seen a dark man appear in their bedrooms at night, and it was even claimed that their 12-year-old foster child Jacob would levitate in the air with enough force that 3 to 4 grown men could not keep him to the ground. Whenever Anne would ask Jacob what was happening to him, he would simply answer that This was the work of Satan. All of this went on for almost 7 years, where several other weird events went on, though mostly happening to Jacob. It has later been speculated that this was a lonely boy's way to gain the attention that he had been missing out on in his life as a foster child. By 1612, Hans Bartskær, the father of the family, had enough, and he blamed Johanne Thomas, a woman who the family previously had quarrels with, for having bewitched the house. When the hearing started, several people from town showed up to testify how bad things had happened to them after talking to Johanne. It was also pointed out how, while she was imprisoned and awaiting trial, she refused to eat anything. How odd! Surely only a witch could survive without food, was the consensus. But, as it turns out, at the time, the prosecutor were responsible for paying the prosecuted's food, and Johanne, being a very stubborn woman, simply refused to eat anything from a man who called her a witch. Johanne's husband also explained that she would gladly eat whatever food he and their children brought her. At first, Johanne refused to take blame, but after the third hearing, another woman, who was also accused of having taken part in the witchcraft surrounding the Bartskær family, confessed. She said that her and Johanne had summoned the devil, who appeared as a rat crawling out of Johanne's well. She also claimed that Johanne made her lame servant girl pee in the baptismal font because Johanne told her that it would cure her ailments. What was going on here was a true witch hunt, since Johanne would confess, point out other witches who allegedly helped her, and these witches would do the same, and so on. All in all, 15 to 20 people were burned as witches because of the events taking place at the Bartskær family home. To this day, a plaque remains in Køge near the house where the haunting should have taken place. This concludes our podcast of the Danish Witch Trials. If you would like to dive deeper into this subject and perhaps visit places in Copenhagen with direct relevance to our dark history, perhaps you could give Kronborg Castle in Helsingør a visit. King James and Queen Anne stayed in the castle for a while after marriage and undoubtedly discussed the witch rumors within the castle walls. You could also visit the Supreme Court in Slotsholmen, where the very last witch in Denmark, Anne Palles, was sentenced to death. Thank you very much for listening to Copenhagen Chronicles. A quick disclaimer. Although I'm history interested, I am no historian. But I do everything in my power to get the right sources and get the story straight. If you have any suggestions for the next episode, please let me know. My contact information is in the description box below the podcast. That's also where you'll find my sources and articles I used for this episode. Oh, and please remember to rate and share this podcast with friends and family. That would help me out a lot. Thank you. Until next time.